Yeah, I mean, I think the key thing is European coordination has moved back to the Cabinet Office. That was where coordination happened before we left. We then had the sort of trip through the bespoke Department for exiting the EU. It then went back into the Cabinet Office, and then when David Frost left the Cabinet as a sort of rush move, the then Prime Minister Boris Johnson moved it to Liz Truss in the Foreign Office. But actually, I think what putting it in the Cabinet Office recognises is that EU issues are to an extent about foreign policy, but they also touch huge areas of domestic policy, which really the Foreign Office is never going to be that interested in. So David Lammy will still lead on where do we go on foreign policy, cooperation and that Defence and Security Pact. But the Cabinet Office still had the people working out the new UK border, and they had the people doing Northern Ireland Windsor framework in conjunction with the Northern Ireland office. So if you think now, an awful lot of our attitude towards the EU is really a sort of game of multi-dimensional chess. If the EU wants to do something new, and we've seen lots of legislation coming through just before the last commission ended, there are sort of lots of questions. Does the UK want to align or not? Really interestingly, in the King's speech, the government appeared to be equipping itself with the power, at least in some areas, to align with EU regulation or to choose not to align if it wanted. Lots of language, Brexity language about sovereign choices, which is really quite interesting. Straw in the wind in something called the Product Safety and Metrology Bill. I recommend that in the explanatory notes, which I think is really interesting.
I mean, even for this podcast, Jill, that is probably too wonkish, I would suggest.
It's quite wonkish, but anyway, makes things easier on Northern Ireland, where Northern Ireland may be subject to new EU rules, but the rest of the UK isn't. So we could sort of say, actually, we won't have that divergence there. Down the track, some voluntary alignment couldn't make it easier, at least for the EU to give us something called mutual recognition of conformity assessment, which even David Frost asked for, which is where UK regulators can say this meets the EU standard, not necessarily the UK standard, which may be different, but it meet the EU standard. So I think that's quite interesting. But you also have to think about the relationship with the devolves, the relationships to other trade agreements, etc. And that sort of central bringing together really can only happen in the Cabinet Office. It's not the Foreign Office's comparative advantage. So I think that really quite serious. You can imagine Nick Thomas-Symonds taking much more interest in all that plethora of committees set up under the Trade and Cooperation Agreement than Foreign Office ministers ever would be able to do, or Foreign Office officials. So I think that's a good move. I think the really interesting thing is, how does the UK government then set itself up to pursue its ambitions? How much does it want to see it can do through this scheduled review of the Trade and Cooperation Agreement? 2026, got a couple of deadlines expiring before then on fisheries and on energy cooperation, quite nasty. And there's an awful lot where the EU is going to be saying, well, you are still implementing these other agreements you've signed up to.